Well, good evening, everyone. My name's Adam Ward, and I'm the still fairly recently arrived Deputy Director of Chatham House. And so it really is a great pleasure and privilege for me to be able to welcome you to what is the 10th lecture to be held in memory of Lord Garden, our former director, who I know is recalled very fondly here. And as always, we're holding this lecture in association with the Liberal International British Group, of which Tim Garden was president. I want particularly to recognize the presence this evening of Sue Garden, Baroness Garden of Frognall, who I'm pleased to say will make some remarks at the conclusion of this evening's event. And I know that her daughters are here with us this evening as well, so welcome to you. I think anybody who studies the career of Tim Garden will immediately see that he combined at least 3 forms of public service. Military service, starting as an RAF pilot and concluding as Assistant Chief of the Defence Staff with wide responsibilities for thinking through the whole structure of our armed forces. Analytical service as a shaper of debates and a much sought-after defence and foreign policy intellectual. And political service, speaking for his party in the House of Lords. And all of this was reflected in a wide array of affiliations and commitments to both causes and institutions. We're delighted that this 10th lecture is being given by someone of the experience and the thoughtfulness of Nick Clegg. And we're grateful that he's chosen to set himself, and us as well, I guess, such an ambitious and overriding exam question, namely whether and how the open international order to which we've grown so used, can be protected from parochialism and populism, and if so, how? As a non-political organization, but one that strives towards cooperative solutions to international problems and challenges, the answer to that question is something that goes really to the heart of the mission of Chatham House, and as it affects many others as well. This meeting is on the record. It's being live streamed on our website. If you tweet, please use the hashtag #CHEvents. Do switch your phones to silent. And with that, can you please join me in warmly welcoming Nick Clegg to address us on the subject, can liberal foreign policy survive the politics of fear? Nick, over to you.
Well, thank you, Adam. Thank you, everyone at Chatham House for hosting this, the 10th and final Lord Garden Memorial Lecture. And particular thanks from me to Sue for inviting me to someone who is now, in parliamentary terms at least, suddenly somewhat homeless and without an address or an abode. It's particularly kind of you to take pity on us errant souls and allow me to join you here this evening. It really is an immense privilege. Fittingly, of course, given Tim's reputation and given the many aspects of his remarkable career, there's been such a distinguished range of academics, journalists and politicians who have made up the cast of lecturers who have spoken before me over the last 10 years. Former Defence Secretary George Robertson, who gave the inaugural lecture, Professor Peter Hennessy, John Snow, Channel 4 News, and my party colleagues and friends, Shirley Williams, Ming Campbell, Paddy Ashdown, have given speeches on subjects ranging from the future of Europe to the rise of Barack Obama, the importance of global defence cooperation, to the implications of the 2010 general election. And so it really is an immense privilege for me to follow them here today and to speak in honour of the memory of Tim. As Adam's mentioned, he moved so effortlessly between many varied worlds, the military, academia, journalism, and of course, politics, which is how I came to know him, if all too briefly. And wherever Tim worked, whoever he spoke to, whatever he argued, he was always respected, not only as a voice of authority, but something which is, alas, increasingly rare today, a voice of great reason. For 3 decades, he served in the RAF, a period during which the terrifying prospect of nuclear war was more real than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and when there seemed to be little hope of a thaw in US-Soviet relations. His military career was varied and distinguished. Tim flew Vulcan planes and Chinook helicopters, commanded an airbase, worked in senior roles at the Ministry of Defence, and later had a spell as director of the Royal College of Defence Studies. He retired from the RAF in 1996 with the rank of Air Marshal, embarking on an equally varied second phase. Well, I should probably take a leaf out of his book, actually. Second phase of his career, which, of course, included a spell as director of this wonderful place, Chatham House. He had a deep knowledge of the inner workings of the Ministry of Defence, of military strategy, and of international politics. But his lightness of touch meant that he was equally at ease explaining highly complex geopolitical issues to the public as he was discussing them in rarefied think tanks in London. And when Tim joined the House of Lords as a Liberal Democrat peer in 2004, those in the party who knew him were, of course, thrilled, and the rest quickly realised that a considerable talent and a real asset had joined their team. Working closely with Charles Kennedy, our then leader, Tim led the challenge to the Labour government as it took the country into the disastrous Iraq War. His was also a crucial voice in debates on British military engagement in Afghanistan, the renewal of the Trident nuclear deterrent, and during the passage of the Electoral Administration Bill in addressing the problems of registration and voting for members of the armed forces and their partners. It is hard to believe that his parliamentary career lasted only 3 years. And it is not hard to see how valuable his sage advice could have been in today's increasingly volatile world. As the UK's future in Europe is shaped by a Conservative Party in collective meltdown, as America is led by an unpredictable president who appears unconvinced of the merits of global leadership, let alone the special relationship, as nationalist leaders tighten their unforgiving grip in Moscow, Budapest, Istanbul, and as conflict rages across the Middle East and in parts of Africa, I'm sure I'm not alone in wishing Tim was here to provide some of his characteristic wisdom and maybe some reassurance too. Throughout much of his military career, he faced a world of competing ideologies as capitalism and communism collided. Yet when the end of the Cold War eventually came, with the reunification of Germany and the reshaping of Europe, Tim, along with all of us, had to adapt suddenly to an era of considerable uncertainty and disruption. Today, nearly 3 decades on from the collapse of the Berlin Wall, we find ourselves in a world in which, once again, old certainties are being questioned and the values we cherish are under threat. A Chatham House audience hardly needs to be told how we arrived in this most unsettling of places, where a critical cocktail of historical events, sociological change, and geopolitical shifts have combined to make the world feel very different today than it did even a decade ago when the first of these lectures was given. The ending of the Cold War, the rise of the internet and social media, and the challenge that has posed to traditional sources of news and information, the end of class-based politics, the global economic crash of 2008 and its hugely disruptive effects, the way that people on low and middle incomes, millions of them, have been left searching for explanations and solutions to their predicament in the years that have followed. And then, as a result, an acute outbreak of populism, nowhere more so than in the Anglo-Saxon world with the vote for Brexit and then the election of Donald Trump. So how do we reassert the values of internationalism, multilateralism, and liberalism? Can a liberal foreign policy survive the politics of fear? My view is it can, but only if we follow 3 important steps. First, quite simply, don't give up. Multilateralism is slow, it is imperfect, but there is no remedy to the challenges faced by modern liberalism which does not require countries to work together. The truth is, we have to pool our sovereignty in order to survive and thrive in the modern world. This has to be restated. It is a simple truth, well understood here, but it has to be restated again and again with conviction and with passion. To pool decision-making with others for mutual benefit isn't a loss of sovereignty. It is the only way in which we secure our strategic interests and guarantee our prosperity and security in a globalized world. A good, current example of the abject failure by politicians of making the case for the painstaking give and take which any multilateral engagement involves is, of course, this government's inability and unwillingness to prepare the British people for the significant compromises that Brexit must entail. The talks, which finally commence this week, will not be easy. In my view, with the clock ticking, there are now 3 possible scenarios left: a disastrous collapse, an extension to the timescale, or a significant softening of the government's negotiating stance to allow a generous transition period in which many of the features of EU membership continue to apply. The humiliating climb down this week on the sequencing of the discussions has already revealed the hollowness of this government's rhetoric and highlighted the inevitability of compromise. The Boris Johnson, Daniel Hannan view of our place in the world is as a swashbuckling nation which can duck and weave if it weren't just held back by others. This seductive idea that we can recapture the imperial reach of the past by throwing off the shackles of multilateralism is a dangerous illusion. They and other critics of the European Union like to claim that the EU is part of the past. Instead, they talk about a future in which a global Britain, unencumbered by EU membership, lies tantalizingly in prospect. In truth, of course, it's exactly the other way round. Global Britain is in many ways a euphemism for imperial nostalgia, while pooling sovereignty in our own hemisphere is the only way to influence those aspects of the modern world, from terrorism to trade, from climate change to fisheries, which cross borders. Those who dismiss the European Union, and the UK being a part of it, are not only rejecting multilateralism, they are also rejecting the idea that we need to stand tall in our own backyard in order to stand tall in the great capitals of the world. Far from increasing our standing in Washington or Beijing, the decision to leave the EU is already seen in those capitals as a sign of Britain's decline, pushing us bit by bit to the margins in international affairs. Take the recent visits of Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping to Europe. Both visited a number of other countries in the EU. Xi Jinping attended an EU summit in Brussels, and Modi visited Germany, France, and Spain. Neither came to the UK or sought one-to-one talks with Theresa May. Both China and India, the 2 supreme new global powers, see working with the EU and not the UK as their priority. China and the EU issued a joint statement on forging ahead with the Paris Accords on climate change, from which the UK was noticeably absent. And ahead of an EU-India summit later this year, Prime Minister Modi has talked about the India-EU trade and investment agreement being restarted during his visit. A deal which, irony of ironies, had been stymied by the stubborn approach of the British government, in particular its former Home Secretary, one Theresa May, who was resistant to granting admission to Indian visitors who want to come to the UK for business, work, or study. You couldn't make it up. The very country that is now claiming that by leaving the EU we will be able to embark on greater free trade was the same country that blocked greater free trade between the European Union and one of the world's great new emerging economic powers. So it is clear to me that to make a difference to the world, you have to have an anchor organized multilaterally in your own hemisphere. This applies to security as much as it does to trade. We don't know what the long-term impact of Brexit will be on our security relationship with America, our leadership role in NATO, or our place on the UN Security Council. But all of those security fundamentals will be weakened if we pursue the vision for Britain favoured by the arch-Brexiteers. Second, we must be aware that to fix populism to address populism also requires us to fix our own economy. I'm not going to pretend that all of our problems can be solved by pursuing a soft Brexit, or indeed by persuading the public to think again about leaving the EU, although I would be the first to celebrate it if they did. The discontent that underlies Donald Trump and Nigel Farage's politics of chauvinism is real. And if we are to beat them, we have got to address that underlying discontent felt by millions of our fellow citizens. Of course, we need to overhaul our international institutions, from the EU to the UN, to make them more efficient and more accountable to the people and the nations they serve. But oddly enough, that's the easy bit. We need to be much tougher on ourselves. The genesis of these problems lie within the socio-economic imbalances in our own society. Mainstream politicians of all stripes are failing to deliver on the bread and butter issues that matter to voters. The housing problem, the housing crisis in our country, for example, has been festering for years, with social housing in decline, too little affordable housing, skyrocketing rents, and an over-reliance on a dysfunctional private sector that has not built enough homes and not enough good quality homes. Real terms incomes have been stagnant since 2008. The prosperity and growth that was promised hasn't arrived. According to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the average British family will be 18%, or £5,000, worse off in 2022 than they would have been had the crash in 2008 never happened. A decline which is unprecedented since records began, possibly unprecedented in the modern industrial era. That this has erupted into a populist backlash, from Syriza in Greece to Podemos in Spain, to the right-wing movements of Marine Le Pen, Geert Wilders, Nigel Farage, none of that should surprise us. But I think we can and should ask ourselves why Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American economies appear to be less resilient to this wave of populism than many, not all, than many mainland European countries. Populism has not been defeated in mainland Europe, but it does appear to have been contained. We were told a few months ago that Wilders would definitely win in the Netherlands, that Le Pen would take the presidency and pull France out of the euro, if not the European Union altogether, and that Angela Merkel's position was definitely in doubt. None of those things have come about. Yet in Britain, a revolution overturned 4 decades of EU membership, and in the United States, an angry populist was elected as president of the most powerful nation in the planet. It is perhaps too early to tell, but it will be important for the future to understand the impact of the different responses in the US and the UK on the one hand, and Europe on the other, to the economic crisis. Here, and in the United States, we managed to keep people in work, but we only did so by presiding over reduced or stagnant pay. In fact, the UK stands alone as a rich, developed economy that experienced a strong economic recovery in which real wages of workers fell. On the continent, by contrast, they experienced mass unemployment, in which the majority were protected by a generous welfare state, and those who did not lose their jobs remained in employment and saw their wages and their in-work entitlements grow. Did this, perhaps, create a body of voters with an inbuilt incentive to hold on to the status quo and shun the wilder risks of populism? It may prove that the much maligned European welfare model, which has numerous problems associated with it, nonetheless did a better job of preserving a sense of common purpose at a time when our society and politics feel like they are fraying at the seams. We need to understand whether low regulation, low pay economies are, as a result, less well insulated from the political storms than our continental neighbours. Third, to beat populism, we must always remind ourselves of the people and the vested interests we're up against. Tomorrow marks a full year since the referendum and the vote to leave the European Union. But time, I think it would be fair to say, has not healed. And the language of that wretched campaign remains very much in use today. The liberal elite, the global elite, saboteurs, or to quote our own Prime Minister, the citizens of nowhere. Those of us who argued for Britain remaining part of the European Union, those of us who believed in a global outlook, those of us who support an internationalist view of the world, were dismissed flippantly, aggressively, incorrectly by people who do not share our values. But it is these people who are truly now an elite. They are the new Brexit elite. While the Brexit eruption of June the 23rd, 2016 was at times angry, in part built on an ugly nationalism and yes, fueled by grassroots discontent, the ideas, the money, the organisation, the propaganda of the Brexit campaign were fueled by an unholy constellation of vested interests. The hedge fund managers, for whom EU-wide regulations are an overburdensome hindrance to their financial ambitions. The owners and editors of the right-wing press, many of whom don't even live here or pay taxes here, whose visceral loathing of the European Union has shaped their respective papers' tone and coverage for decades. The Tory backbenchers, many of whom still inhabit a preposterous past in which Britannia still rules the waves and diplomacy is best conducted from the royal yacht. A handful of multi-millionaire businessmen who have, in some cases over 30 years or more, bankrolled whichever party or politician stands on the most aggressive EU-bashing platform. And, perhaps most sinister of all, dizzyingly wealthy individuals in the United States whose money is now being traced from libertarian think tanks to Donald Trump's presidential campaign and now to those organisations who helped to fight to take the United Kingdom out of the European Union. What unites that new Brexit elite? What unites those disparate vested interests? What unites them is this: a shared vision of Britain as a low-tax, low-regulation nation, a sort of Singapore on stilts, standing precariously on its own, cast adrift from Europe, and, so they would argue, able to do as it pleases. Or rather, in the case of this new Brexit elite, able to do as they please. Nothing would guarantee greater turbulence and fear than their vision of the future. For reasons which she has never managed to explain, this vision was, and perhaps continues to be, Theresa May's vision too. Brexit meant Brexit, she told us endlessly, and in her case, it meant the most extreme and ideologically rigid of all Brexits. Dragging Britain out of the single market and the customs union, ending freedom of movement, pulling Britain out of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, and as a result, denying this country vital access to EU-wide security databases. With so much uncertainty in the world today, it is a truly dangerous vision for Britain. But it was a vision, in many ways, rejected at the recent general election. And it is a vision that we must never, ever allow to succeed at the ballot box. And to ensure it never does, we must respond with urgency and with careful thought to the challenges that liberalism, internationalism, and multilateralism face today. This speech may not have focused in depth on global affairs, but that is because at root, the crisis that liberal internationalism finds itself in today is not actually about foreign policy at all. It is about domestic policy, about the socio-economic conditions that people have to contend with, and most importantly, the disruptive aftershocks of the 2008 economic crash and the different ways in which different developed economies and mature democracies have responded to those aftershocks. And these are challenges that must be and can be addressed with deep and radical thinking, with a patient commitment to the causes that drive us, and with a refusal to give in, even when it seems that those very causes are under sustained and relentless attack. If we do that, if we work together, then liberalism, internationalism, and multilateralism, the principles and values that Tim believed in, can thrive. And the problems of recent months will be seen for what I hope they are, a series of bumps on the road to a more open world. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for what was a bracing, but ultimately not a pessimistic assessment, rather the opposite. Let me perhaps just provoke you on 2 points in response to that. Why do you think it's proved so difficult, especially in this country, to persuade people of the benefits of pooling of sovereignty? How do you account for the instinctive aversion to that, the gap between that and what you see as the self-evident benefits of it?
I think there are many reasons, but I think clearly because we did not experience, thankfully, some of the violent and traumatic ruptures that other European countries did, occupation, war, fascism, defeat, we were able to draw on a sort of sense of sort of continuous exceptionalism, which doesn't encourage the idea that in order to do the best for yourself, you need to sort of work hand in glove with others. It's something that the British political and media establishment, I think, has always misunderstood. I remember shortly after I entered into government, back, it was a long time now, 2010, it was the height of yet another Eurozone crisis, and I remember sitting in a meeting with the then Chancellor, the then Governor of the Bank of England, and various senior members of the Cabinet and various senior mandarins from Whitehall, and I was breezily told, well, the Euro is going to collapse within 3 months. Of course it is. And well, the European Union will probably unravel within about 6. I said, look, maybe the Euro does have shaky economic foundations, but you misunderstand, I said, the visceral, cultural and historical reasons why there is a commitment to what in many respects are sometimes even somewhat shaky or irrational policies on the part of other EU countries. If you are one of the founding member states, France, Germany, the Netherlands, etc., you know, the resonance of European integration, or the association of European integration as an act of peace after war, if you're from Portugal, Greece, Spain, the association of entering into the European club of democracy after fascism, if you are part of, you know, the family of nations in Central and Eastern Europe that joined later, it's kind of liberty after Soviet communism. We never had any, we never had those profound emotional roots. The roots of our European identity have always been quite lightly held and quite shallow, which is why it's been so easy to uproot them. And I think there are many explanations, and not least some of these vested interests that I talked about, which have been at it for years. But I don't think they would have succeeded in uprooting our European identity as successfully as they did if we had had a different history.
So second provocation, you seem very confident, you made a very strong argument that populism is something that can be attacked through technocratic policies, sound economic judgments in policy, and a variety of other measures. What do you say to those people who say, well, actually there's something more to this, there's something more ephemeral, hard to pin down, there's a zeitgeist element to this, it's like a fever that's infected the body politic and it just needs to sweat itself out and there'll be a return over time to something more like we've been accustomed to?
Well, I'm sure things will change, of course, and it is quite important, that, by the way, that populism and populists are seen to fail.
Yeah, this is an experiment that hasn't been run yet.
No, but it's very important that Trump is seen to fail. I would love to see what I consider to be the sort of policy populism of Corbyn tested and failed, because I think it's a nonsense. It's simplistic solutions to very complex problems. I wish Theresa May had not become. I wish Michael Gove or Boris Johnson had become Prime Minister last year, because they were the ones who got us into the mess, and I'd love to see them held accountable for it. So you do need populists to be tested and failed, and that takes a bit of time for sure. But I don't regard it in the slightest bit technocratic to say that the challenge for mainstream politicians is not just to bemoan populists and say how ghastly they are, not to just try and sort of out-compete them on emotion and vitriol, but to provide better answers for some of the underlying socioeconomic dysfunction. I mean, it's a bold claim to make, but I would hazard a sort of guess that if 2008 had not happened, we wouldn't have voted as a country to leave the European Union, and Trump wouldn't have been elected as president. I think it is impossible to exaggerate the entirely legitimate rage and powerlessness that people feel. And I met lots of them in the run-up to the referendum on 23rd of in fact, I remember vividly, I was standing on a street corner in a lovely part of my then constituency. I don't say that bitterly. Handing out leaflets and this chap came, very nice guy. Over the years, I'd helped her. I remember he had a daughter who had learning difficulties, and I'd helped her get into a school. And he said, "Hi, Nick," very cheerful. I said, "Well, how are you going to vote tomorrow?" He said, "Oh, I'm going to vote for Brexit." I said, "Well, you don't want to do that. Why are you doing that?" He said, "Oh, come on, Nick." He said, "I'm not going to vote for Remain. Remain sounds as if everything's fine. Just carry on as you are." It was really quite interesting. It was the word Remain that sort of annoyed him. He said, "It isn't all perfect." And he said, "I haven't had a pay rise in 8 years. Mm-hmm. Every week and every month, I'm taking less money home because of problems I didn't create. It was those wretched bankers who screwed up. You politicians telling me it's all going better now. The regulators messed up. Are any of them being held to account? And you want me to tick the box to Remain?" And I had no argument for that, because he was sort of saying, no, the status quo is rubbish. And almost anything is better than what I've got, which is what I'm referring to in the speech. I do think we need to ask ourselves why the kind of Rust Belt reaction in America, the kind of lurching from one kind of false hope or false promise of salvation seems to catch on more. I mean, there's almost a sort of political nihilism in which people say, "Oh, to hell with this, I'll try anything." Whereas I actually think if you look at what's happening in the Netherlands and France and Germany and Spain, there's an army of voters there who actually have an incentive to hold on to what they've got and not risk it on the kind of roulette table of populism. Sorry, what was the question?
I don't know, but the answer will do. It's fine. And then finally, you talked about the particular susceptibility of the Anglo-Saxon economies to these challenges, and that the welfare model in Europe was more effective in dealing with some of these issues. It was a close-run thing in France, in some ways. In the run-up to it, it seems closer than it ultimately transpired to be. In the light of Macron, do you think there's a risk of complacency about actually getting to grips with the root causes of some of what produced Le Pen?
Sure. No, yeah, absolutely. And and Mark Rutte had to duck and weave furiously to sort of, kind of genuflect towards a lot of the anti-immigration rhetoric in the Netherlands, and Rajoy has somehow scraped his way back into power in Spain by hook or by crook, and Macron, of course, wasn't a sort of never. No, of course, you absolutely mustn't be complacent, and no one must at all imagine that populism is going to disappear. And no, by the way, just a word on populism. Gandhi was a populist. There's a very powerful, positive role for populism in shaking up a complacent elite or an unsatisfactory status quo. It's an incredibly important antidote to elitism, complacency, and so on and so forth. But I just wonder, and as I say, I just pose this as a question. Given how much, particularly the kind of Anglo-American commentariat and kind of media and political elite has sort of said, well, because it's happened in America, because it's happened in Britain, well, of course it's just a matter of time before it happens in Germany, Spain. And it didn't work out like that at all in all of those countries. Central and Eastern Europe is slightly different. There's an outburst of chauvinism there. But you need to ask yourself why millions of voters shunned the siren voices of angry, simplistic populism. And I'm just posing it as a question. I wonder whether it's because those who are in work, and there the facts are very clear. Partly because of the way the tax system has worked, the way in which in-work benefits are administered, which change from one country, partly because of the way wage bargaining operates. You have just seen, for those who are lucky to be in work, and I'm not advocating this necessarily as a great model, because it's been accompanied by mass youth unemployment, but the fact is you've got an army of people in work for whom they've barely noticed an impact on their in-work entitlements and pay. Whereas here, you've got folk, particularly in the public sector, who've seen a remorseless real-term squeeze on their incomes for year after year after year after year. And I just think that has a very profound effect on the way in which you look on the world. After year after year after year, however hard you work even longer hours than before, and you earn the same or you earn less, I think it has such a debilitating effect on your sort of mood towards the future.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's get to some questions from the floor. If you want to catch my eye, do the obvious thing and raise your hand. We're going to take these questions one at a time. Make your questions, therefore, crisp and concise, please, and do make them questions. And for Nick's benefit, please give your name and your precise affiliation. I know most of you are Chatham House members, but a little bit more detail would be useful. And do wait for the roaming microphone to reach you. First gentleman, catch my eye, right at the back. Yes.
Ian Silvera, International Business Times. Mr. Clegg, if there was another EU referendum tomorrow, what would the result be and why?
I don't know. Every prediction I made the last 10 years has been wrong, so I'm not going to make it up. So, no doubt I get it wrong. I don't know. I honestly don't know. The only thing I do think is obvious now is, firstly, there has thankfully been a real mobilisation of young people generally, which is great, fantastic. And if we can keep, and that's, I think Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto is one of the most cynical and callow manifestos I've ever seen. But he does need to be praised for becoming the kind of rallying point for many, many young people. I really hope that remains, because it'll provide balance to this terrible incentive, which is what it's been until now, for politicians of all parties to cater to older voters at the cost of younger voters. So clearly of course it's very ironic that lots of young people have rallied to Jeremy Corbyn's standard, even though his manifesto is almost indistinguishable from Theresa May's when it comes to Brexit. But anyway, many voters, young voters, clearly think that he's the new Messiah who will protect them from hard Brexit. And I'm assuming would happen again in the referendum. Lots of young people voted actually very large numbers on the 23rd of June last year. I think over 60% turnout for voters between the ages of 18 to 24. Over 70% of those voting to remain. But that compares to, I think, over 90% turnout for some of the older kind of cohorts. And if that could be levelled up, that would have a dramatic effect. And I think it's now pretty widely understood by the public that the most notable claim of 350 million quid for the NHS is a lie. And crucially, I think it is dawning on voters that this is altogether more complex, more painful, more lengthy, and economically possibly more harmful than they thought when we tossed that coin last year. So I, of course, would like to think the result will be a resounding vote to stay in the European Union.
Tricia here in the front row, please.
So many things. My name's Tricia de Borgrav. I'm an opinion writer. A couple of things. You don't mention the role of the press, but I think that it's the last 20 years of covering the EU as it's been covered in this country has made a lot of people who are Brexiteers it was very easy for them to vocalise their emotional response
Sure.
to whether they stayed in or not. I've lived many, many years in an area of Spain where there is no tabloid press, and when one talks about the failures of a government or a system, there's not that knee-jerk reaction that one gets from these myths, these titles. How much do you think the press played a part in the Brexit vote? And it was easy to go there, whereas for Remainers it was more difficult to, basically be eloquent about why they wanted to remain.
Of course it has an impact if year after year, day after day, week after week, month after month, you're constantly, fed a sort of rich diet of, sometimes completely fictional stories about this directive, that directive, this, monstrous bureaucracy in Brussels, which I think at least used to be only sort of half the size of Birmingham City Council, whose budget is a fraction of our own national one, and all that kind of stuff. Of course that has an effect. My own view is that it's reported, at least, I've no idea, I must ask you whether this is true, but it's reported that Paul Dacre, the vile editor of the Daily Mail, has said to David Cameron when they met in Downing Street, I think either in the run-up or during the referendum, he pointed to the television and said, that's why you'll lose the referendum. And he pointed to a picture of hapless refugees in dinghies fleeing from the Syrian conflict. And what he did day after day after day after day to millions of people is conflate the Mediterranean refugee crisis with violence and terrorism of the European Union. And that quite understandably made a lot of people go, whoa, 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 I'm not sure if I want that. It was cynical, it was untrue, and it was devastatingly effective. And so I think there are lots of things that came together to deliver this narrow majority for Brexit. But in the same way that I wonder whether we would have voted as a nation for Brexit if, as that chap I was talking to in Sheffield explained to me, if people weren't suffering year after year of a squeeze on their real incomes after 2008, I also wonder whether actually they wouldn't have got that final edge in the debate if that Mediterranean refugee crisis had not been happening at the same time, and if the British tabloid press, from their point of view, devastatingly effective, if utterly mendacious, used that as the sort of emotional calling card to voters who were still making up their minds. So yeah, of course it has an effect. But I mean, look, having said that, I mean, I sometimes think maybe we can sometimes exaggerate the influence. There's no one single influence. I mean, sometimes I have to say to you, looking back on it, I think it's remarkable that 48% of people voted to remain. I mean, if you write on a piece of paper all the forces that were concatenating to sort of nudge people in one way or the other, I mean, it's a remarkable achievement. It was such a close-run thing in the end.
Thank you. Woman right at the back in the black top. If you just hold up your hand so the people with the microphone can see. Yes.
Hi, Eleanor Perch. Work for a political regulator, but my question is, in the Scandinavian countries, and Denmark in particular, there's a much higher standard of living than there is here, and the gap between rich and poor is infamously much smaller. But there's been a huge increase of anti-European Union and anti-European feeling, and the kind of populist vote there as well. How would you sort of explain that when there isn't the same kind of socio-economic issues that are happening there that are happening here?
Well, for a start, those caricatures are not quite as neat as you might imagine. I won't bore you with it, but I mean, some of the caricatures of the growth of inequality in this country inequality is unfortunately set to increase quite rapidly in this country. But broadly speaking, it exploded in the 80s and then remained relatively stable until basically now, particularly if the government goes ahead with certain measures. But inequality has actually dramatically increased in some other previously more egalitarian countries. They've experienced, I'm not sure about Denmark, but certainly Sweden has experienced per head far greater introduction of refugees from the violence in the Middle East and elsewhere, far on a scale that I think would be almost unimaginable here. But I'll tell you one area where I think there is some common thread between what I was talking about earlier, which is the sort of exceptionalism of British history compared to some of the rupture elsewhere, is actually you hear a similar way in which people talk about European integration in Scandinavia. We sort of joined with a sort of collective shrug of our shoulders in the 70s. It was a sort of, oh, well, damn this European community. If we can't beat them, we might as well join them. We sort of shuffled in, and we had to sort of... It was almost an admission that we no longer ruled the waves, and oh, well, we better pitch in. It wasn't done with a great deal of enthusiasm. It was sold, as if it was sold in the 70s as if we were sort of all taking out pocket calculators to work out, whether the prices would be cheaper in the shops. There was nothing emotionally aspirational. It was almost an admission of our relative decline in the international pecking order that we decided to join the European club. You hear very similar language, almost similar adjectives and adverbs in the way in which the act of joining Europe in Scandinavia took place first. It was also an admission that the exceptionalism of the Scandinavian welfare model could no longer continue in isolation. So it was done almost out of a sense of resignation rather than out of a sense of aspiration and triumph. And I think that's one of the reasons why you have quite similar Eurosceptic language in Scandinavia and in Britain.
Great, thank you. Gentleman here in the second row in the blue blazer. Just wait for the mic again.
Hello, my name is Dennis Loretto. I'm a Liberal Democrat and member of the European Movement. Is not one of the reasons, perhaps the main reason, why there is not evidence of a major shift in public opinion towards staying in the EU is the utterly unrealistic promises that are being given. It seems to me that both the Conservative and Labour parties are saying this. We will be able to get an agreement which will give us virtually, sometimes they leave out the virtually, everything that we already have in the single market and the European, and the customs union, and we will not have to pay anything, or very little. We will not have to have the jurisdiction of the European Court, and we'll not have to let anybody in except if we want them coming in, immigrants. And all of the other 27 will continue to have all of those obligations, and everybody will be perfectly happy with that. Now, you don't have to say it to see how ridiculous that is. How soon will it be shown how ridiculous that is?
Well, as Mark Carney elegantly put it, there is a long, fine tradition of cake and consumption rhetoric when it comes to how the Brexiteers talk about this. And that's, by the way, combined with a very British and a rather admirable sort of pragmatic, phlegmatic attitude, which I certainly encountered in my ill-fated attempts to be re-elected in Sheffield Hallam. I'm not bitter, I promise you I'm not. Which is, and I heard this phrase over and over again on the doorstep, was, better make the best of it. Yeah. It's a very admirable thing. Well, yes, we are where we are. Move along. Come on, we better make the best of it. So I think the combination of the sort of cake and consumption rhetoric, the fact that Brexit hasn't happened, the negotiations haven't started, a lot of the economic reality has not yet impinged fully on people, and an admirable British sort of shrug of the shoulders and, oh, well, we are where we are. I think all of those things have totally understandably combined, and because no one's being asked to make another decision. The public's not being asked to make another decision. So I think all of that's quite understandably combined to I mean, I don't know, I genuinely don't follow the polls on this, but I'm assuming there's a sort of stasis, if not a slight shift towards Brexit in the polls, in as much as they're meaningful at all, which I don't think they are remotely, because people will be asked wholly theoretical questions. So it doesn't actually surprise me. When will that change? Well, it'll change when reality bites. When? Well, it's kind of upon us pretty soon. The negotiations have started, and you have a political establishment in Westminster. You're quite right, Dennis. Both the Labour and the Conservative parties, who refuse to spell out to the British people that you cannot enter into a negotiation with 27 sovereign governments and parliaments and expect them to give you everything you want without entering into very difficult, sometimes controversial, even unpopular compromises. The British people haven't been prepared at all, because the Labour Party, you had this peculiar election where we were told that it was about Brexit, and then both Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn, for completely different reasons, decided to talk about everything else but Brexit. Because Theresa May was told by Linton Crosby she had to talk about herself. It was a me election. And he, of course, has no interest in talking about the European Union at all. He wants to sort of change the subject. So I think it's going to be quite a rude awakening over the next months. We had a sliver, a sort of tiny intimation of what this was like when David Davis had to capitulate on his ludicrous claim there was going to be a major row in the summer about the order of the talks. It's not even a particularly important row to have. And as far as I can make out, the EU had already gone some way to try and accommodate the government's position by saying that they'll shift to discussing the future trade arrangements when serious progress has been made on the kind of divorce issues now. But we've already seen a smidgen of what it's going to be like. Everyone is already hyperventilated about what a humiliating climb down that was. If the scheduling of the subjects of the negotiations is considered to be a humiliating climb down, my golly, what is going to come is going to feel a whole lot worse. And then this is, of course, where I defer to economists in the audience, but my own view is, particularly because of the growing self-confidence in the Eurozone, because of our sudden and rather precipitate decline in our growth rates, because of low productivity, very high levels of public and private indebtedness in this country, because we're an unusually open economy, very, very reliant on ideas and people and money and investment from other parts of the world. I just find it defies belief that you can abruptly, in the next 14 months, which is about all we've got of negotiating time, unplug yourself from your largest and most mature markets and not create significant economic disruption. So I think political haplessness in the negotiating chamber, combined with economic reality, will be felt pretty damn quickly.
Thank you. There's a gentleman here in the fourth row, in the grey blazer and the blue shirt. If other people from different sections of the audience further back would like to have a comment to make, please. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Pedro Solares. I'm a member of Chatham House. Let me preface this by saying I agree with everything you have said. But most people have not agreed with you. Why are people like us refighting a lost war or a lost battle rather than looking forward a few years, like 5, to fight the next battle, which you said is going to be won on domestic issues, not on international issues? The last one was lost on domestic issues, you said, but yet you're still talking about the world liberal order. Most people don't care about that. It's the domestic ones. So why are you addressing the people who are already convinced or very angry of what happened last year, rather than the people who voted to leave?
Well, because it's Chatham House. I'm not. This isn't a forum for discussing. Well, we can talk about class sizes and taxation. It's not. I mean, this is Chatham House. This lecture is to talk about foreign policy and the interaction with government policy. I don't think I am fighting. In fact, I'm trying to make a central observation, which is if you want to face the future with greater confidence, you can only understand what's happening internationally if you understand the depth of the imbalances in our own economies.
Okay, lady in the green shawl there with a hand up. 7, 8 rows back, something like that.
Hello, I'm Flora Carmichael. I work for the BBC World Service. I wanted to take you back to the question, like your examiner, and ask you about the fear element, because it sounds to me like it's the liberal ruling classes that are peddling the fear, and that people are looking for hope through populism. So can you address that?
No, I don't think that is an accurate characterisation. If you feel that your job is ever more perilous, your take-home pay is ever more restricted, and you worry about events which are deeply alarming, most notably but not exclusively violence and increasingly unpredictable forms of terrorist violence. In other words, if you inhabit a world of pervasive insecurity, of course you search for hope, but you do so out of fear. You do so out of fear. It's the most natural instinct in the world. And my only point is that it is not good enough for sort of mainstream small L liberal politicians and parties and thinkers, or even think tanks, to bemoan populism. You have to assemble better answers for what generates that fear in the first place. Otherwise, all you're doing is simply sort of trying to compete with populism by complaining about it. Now, there's a whole separate question about, which I try to touch on. I think there's a real problem in the British economy about pay progression, or rather the lack of it. So, I'm just observing that we as an economy have quite rightly congratulated ourselves for keeping large numbers of people in work, while other countries have seen a huge explosion in unemployment. But we've done that at the cost of an explosion in in-work poverty. When I started in politics, poverty was basically associated with unemployment. Poverty in the Anglo-American economies is now an in-work phenomenon. And I don't think we've remotely understood what that means for our welfare system, our tax system, our labour markets. Now we're starting to. You know, the tax credit system is an important feature of this. Minimum wage, living wage is a very important feature of this. But that's my view. My view is you cannot, in a mature democracy, expect millions and millions of your fellow citizens to work harder and make do with less for close to a decade and not see that phenomenon erupt into political dissatisfaction. I just think it's kind of obvious. So the question is not to sort of kind of complain about it, and certainly not to spread fear about it, but to come up with better answers to those deep imbalances. That's my simple point. So it's not about whether you choose fear or hope. Everybody should always choose hope where you can, but hope has to be a substantive hope. It needs to be a hope which is real and which can genuinely change things. And that's what I personally objected so much to. I totally understood the highly attractive free stuff for everybody, all paid for by 3% of the tax-paying population from corporate. But it's a nonsense. It's an absolute nonsense. So actually the job is to, yes, appeal to that hope, but do it with credible and real, tangible solutions, not yet more false prospectuses.
We'll take just 3 more questions, I'm afraid, because we're running out of time fast, and I'll try to take them one from each section of the audience. Gentleman here in the suit and the black tie has been waiting a very long time.
Hello. Excuse me, Marco Soproniuk. I'm an incoming graduate student at Oxford and a recovering management consultant. Question for you is, in France, we saw the rise of a new centrist force from the ashes of the centre-right and the centre-left. In Britain, because of sort of ingrained divides and almost historical grievances between parties, it's very hard for me to imagine many Tory and Labour MPs or even members defect to the Liberal Democrats. So my question for you is, forgive me, are the Liberal Democrats standing in the way of a new centrist force in British politics?
I'm not aware that the Liberal Democrats have said to some budding Macron, how dare you? I'm not really sure that's in the gift of the Liberal Democrats, to be honest. Look, this is I've spoken to Macron himself and many people around him about this. It's very, very different, a presidential and a parliamentary system. And if you launched a sort of en marche, on the move movement in the UK, I strongly suspect that if you're not careful, you'd get a great deal of media attention, and lots of people up and down the country say they'd love it. And the polls would show, I don't know, 20% of people think it's a great idea. And you'd have widespread but quite shallow support across the country, and you might get 1 MP. Because our electoral system doesn't reward widespread movements for change. We have this crazy electoral system, which you know, I don't really feel any compassion for Nigel Farage, but I felt even a smidgen when I saw that his party, 4 million votes, and all they got for that was Douglas Carswell. That is such a poor return on your electoral investment. So we have historical, parliamentary, but we have this system which is basically rigged against, you know, in the economic management speak, against new market entrants. And so I think it's a very high hurdle. I mean, for what it's worth, I've always thought that if, you know, for people, there's endless talk and seminars and private discussions about realignments and da-da-da, I don't really think anything is ever going to happen in a big way unless there are as a substantive body of men and women in the Labour Party who are prepared to say, we will leave the Labour Party behind. Not create a breakaway faction, but to leave it behind. I don't see where else you'd get the kind of impetus and momentum for something which is kind of big enough to change the political weather. And of course, what's happened now, I think they're making a mistake, but don't understand why they're doing it, is that a lot of the kind of critics of Corbyn are suddenly discovering hitherto well-concealed enthusiasm and admiration for this excellent manifesto and the extraordinary leadership skills of Jeremy Corbyn. I think they're making a mistake because I think he'll be found out eventually, and I think they should stick to their guns. But that's what they're doing. So with a few very notable exceptions, the Labour Party's kind of, they clearly believe with one more heave they'll get in. Maybe they will. I doubt it very much myself, because actually what happened when the election was, Jeremy Corbyn was subject to a huge amount of abuse, but no scrutiny. Everything's very different when you're suddenly subject to scrutiny and less abuse. But no, my views on that really are genuinely irrelevant. But my answer to you is I think we got some quite profound mechanical and cultural reasons that mitigate against the kind of Springer surprise type en marche experiment. And I personally think nothing in that sort of area can happen unless something quite big happens within the Labour Party, and that's clearly not happening now.
Great. We'll take the last two questions together.
Right.
The gentleman right at the back in the blue shirt, and then you here in the second row.
Thank you very much. Michael Pugh, lawyer, festival organiser and university lecturer. So coalitions are very much a theme at the moment, and with the DUP, we're looking very carefully at how parties that could make up a coalition are able to leverage their smaller number of seats to achieve their agenda. To what extent, Nick Clegg, do you believe that the participation of the Liberal Party in the Tory coalition between 2010-2015 led to factors that created a politics of fear, which then in turn led to the vote for Brexit?
Okay, and then, yes, please, here in the second row.
Charlotte, I'm a member of the Lib Dems. My question is to do with the recent French election, and you were talking about Macron and how Marine Le Pen was seen to be rejected. What is the very low turnout of around 40%? What is that a reflection of? Is that a reflection of people accepting the status quo and therefore not going out to vote? Is that people being fed up with politics and so therefore not participating full stop?
Well, let me take the latter first. Do you mean the low turnout in the latest rounds of the parliamentary elections? Yeah, don't you think? I always think it's just a bit. People get a bit knackered, don't they? Voting. No, I'm serious. You're asked to vote how many times in like a matter of a few weeks? Like 4 times?
It's the Bristol Brenda factor.
What? Yeah. Well, I really. I mean, I don't know. Maybe some French members of the audience could tell us, but I kind of think people kind of felt once they got through the drama of Macron becoming president, and it kind of became obvious that Le Pen wasn't going anywhere. It was kind of job done, and then it was. I mean, I just think people. The main decision had been taken, as far as the French people were concerned. In a sense, what the elections of the Assemblée Nationale are as ever, a bit of a footnote. Felt like a bit of a foregone conclusion, and I think I'm right in saying you sort of historically tend to get this sharp drop off after tight or dramatic presidential elections. So that's sort of my slightly amateur human interpretation of that. Boy, have I been accused of being responsible for almost everything, which is untoward. But this contorted argument, if that's what you were suggesting in your argument, that if the Liberal Democrats hadn't entered into the coalition in 2010, that wouldn't have led to the circumstances which then subsequently led to Brexit is, forgive me, I find more than absurd. For a start, well, you asked it, so I'm going to give you an answer. So.
I'm afraid you haven't got the microphone, so you can't be heard, but I think we get the gist of your... Yeah.
Well, a number of things. Firstly, the referendum only happened because David Cameron got a majority of his own. He and George Osborne repeatedly, for a short period of time, tried to prevail upon me to agree to a referendum on this issue when we were in coalition. And it was only because the Liberal Democrats steadfastly said, absolutely not on your Nelly are we going to sort of export your internal family dispute into this great plebiscite, that it didn't happen for those 5 years. Secondly, the damage that was done to the sort of body politic and to our economy and to our society was done because of the greatest economic heart attack and crisis that our country has seen since the oil crash in the early 1970s, in 2008. It wasn't invented by the coalition government. If what you're suggesting is the coalition invented those terrible socioeconomic scars that still have... I know you keep saying you don't suggest it, but then you do. But so let me just... let me give you the answer. The answer is no. I don't think the coalition government invented a lot of the socioeconomic problems that we're still dealing with. They were principally, but not exclusively, and they were certainly accentuated by the grievous downturn in 2008 and beyond. In a sense, the history books will record that the 2010 to 2015 coalition was in many ways just a sort of emergency cleanup operation, trying to kind of stabilize the ship, trying to fill the holes, trying to stop the banking system from toppling over altogether, trying to introduce changes in the tax system to allow people to retain most of their income, sheltering, as actually happened because of my own personal intervention, sheltering schools from the most aggressive savings at the time, and so on and so forth. But you know, we were teetering on the edge of a precipice back in 2010. I remember when I came into government being told by a otherwise entirely expressionless Mandarin that the full liabilities, toxic liabilities of the British banking system were 5 times bigger than the size of the whole British economy. So what that government had to do in very invidious circumstances was basically diffuse a massive powder keg, which if it had gone off would have made the IMF intervention in the 70s in this country look like a Sunday school picnic. It wasn't the coalition that invented the terrible damage that over-leveraged banking system and the deepest downturn in modern times caused. We were kind of left holding the baby, but it wasn't us who... No, I'm mixing my metaphors hopelessly now, but we were not... powder kegs and babies don't where we were. Anyway, you hear my point. Was it a perfect government? Was it? Of course it was not. Was it, in my view, a brave and decent government trying to provide stability, both political and economic stability, at a time when governments were falling like ninepins across the rest of Europe, and at the same time doing a lot of very progressive things in education, in tax, on apprenticeships, on pensions reform? That's the way I look at it. I think so as you can hear, I reject the idea that somehow we sowed the seeds for Brexit. If those were sowed, they were sowed a long time before David Cameron and I entered number 10 in 2010.
Thank you. At this point, I'd like to close the discussion and invite Sue Garden to come up, say a few words of thanks and a few words to close the event for us today.
Ladies and gentlemen, 10 years after Tim's death, we've decided to conclude these lectures in his honour. And very, very sincere thanks to Nick, not only for your warm personal words about Tim, but for such an insightful and thought-provoking lecture. We've really appreciated that you've given your time to do this. And I would like to thank our 10 distinguished lecturers. I know you mentioned most of them, but for completion's sake, they were George Robertson, Paddy Ashdown, Shirley Williams, Peter Hennessy, John Snow, Ming Campbell, Stuart Peach, Chief of Defence Staff, Robin Niblett, the director here, John Holmes, former ambassador, and now Nick. They were all people who knew Tim personally and who shared his internationalism, his principles, and his work for peace and security. But I would just like to say a few words about the remarkable man we remember and who was such an essential part of my life for over 40 years. As Nick has already said, he did have a meteoric career in the Royal Air Force. He was an acting pilot officer, giddy heights, when we met in 1964 when we were both 20-year-old Oxford undergraduates. And he was promoted through 9 ranks at the earliest opportunity in each rank. It did involve us in moving 24 times in 30 years, so life was not exactly a picnic. And he was tipped for the top. And it came to a grinding halt overnight when, on the eve of his appointment as a commander-in-chief, he was unexpectedly called in by the chief and told out of the blue that the appointment was conditional on my giving up work. It would be utterly unacceptable for a CNC's wife to work and would set a very bad example for other Air Force wives.
My gosh.
Now, Tim had long been a champion of equal opportunities, so without hesitation, he profoundly disagreed out of principle. His appointment and his career were promptly cancelled. I think he would be pleased to know that there are now working wives and mothers who are themselves Air Vice Marshals. 20 years ago, working wives were still in some quarters anathema. But seeing he would not be allowed to take up the top jobs for which he knew he was top choice, he saw little point in hanging around, and so he added his name to the Volunteers for Early Retirement. So at 51, this brightest and best and youngest of air marshals became an unemployed civilian. He turned down some lucrative offers from industry, which would certainly have helped with our late mortgage, but he couldn't see how they were going to help him to make the world a better place. So he was really delighted to be appointed here director of Chatham House. It was a very modest salary, but he figured that would leave him time for his own research and writings. On arrival here, he discovered a very different job from the one advertised. This internationally renowned organisation was very rapidly going bust. So he abandoned any thought of doing his own thing, and he set about a painful rescue plan, restructuring, cutbacks, economies, redundancies which he loathed. He sweated blood to get the best possible deal for anybody who was having to lose their jobs, not through their own fault, but through mismanagement. But of course, it was more important than ever to keep up the high profile of the director's job and not to let people realise just what a complete case this place was. And of course we know, which Robin does so well and so busily these days. So hosting heads of state, international travels, conferences, speeches, meetings, high-level negotiations. It was an absolutely blistering combination with barely a day off. But when he saw that Chatham House had turned the corner and had a secure financial future, he gave 6 months' notice and he retired to go freelance. Now, he was a gift to the media. As Nick has already mentioned, he had great communication skills. He had a vast network of contacts and friends and an encyclopedic mind, so he could actually talk on just about anything coherently. And in the run-up to Iraq, he used his media contacts to pound the studios, telling anybody who would listen that we would be absolutely wrong to invade, war was wrong, wrong, wrong. And that was when he fell in with the Liberal Democrats, who, if you will remember, were the only political party to be against the war. He became an advisor to Charles Kennedy, as Charles courageously had to face up to slings and arrows from Parliament and media for a stand he knew was morally right. And we have with us tonight another Liberal Democrat leader who courageously stood up to onslaughts in coalition for what was the right thing to do. It's not all fun being a Lib Dem leader, I don't think, as we seem to be discovering again at the moment. Anyway, at the first opportunity, Charles put Tim into the Lords as the party's defence spokesman. And he used this platform as an indefatigable champion of the armed forces, peace, security, justice, internationalism. But after only 3 years, pancreatic cancer cut short his life. And when I followed Tim into the Lords, I was moved by people from all sides of the chamber wanting to tell me what an impact he'd made and how much he would be missed. Our daughters, Alex and Antonia, and the family, we remember the man we loved. And these lectures have been a wonderful tribute to Tim's work. We do appreciate that 10 distinguished people have been prepared to speak in his name on issues which were so very dear to his heart. So, thank you to you, the audience. I know some of you have been here for most, if not all, of these lectures, and that support's been very greatly appreciated. Particular thanks to Robert Woodthorpe Brown and Liberal International British Group, who initiated these lectures 10 years ago. To you, Adam, for chairing tonight, to Robin, to the staff of Chatham House, for your support and your hospitality. Thank you very much. And our final thanks go to our 10 stars, the lecturers, and most especially, Nick, to you. Tim thought very highly of you. He knew you would be a great leader, and he wasn't wrong in that. And he would have relished your wonderful talk tonight and the views you've expressed and the questions you've posed, and he would have been more prepared to argue them with you, I'm quite sure. So you've done him proud, and you have brought these lectures to a wonderful grand finale, a wonderful celebration of a wonderful man. So we wish you all the very best for whatever the future holds. I'm so glad you're not bitter about Sheffield. May I say that some of the rest of us are entitled to be. Anyway, just before I finished, I have been asked to remind you that you're all invited to a reception upstairs, so please do join us there. But meanwhile, please, can I ask everybody here to join me in thanking Nick very much indeed for a wonderful lecture.